His name was Dr. Julian Hartwell, a British ethnobotanist who vanished into the uncharted Javari River 2 decades ago. A brilliant British ethnobotanist, Hartwell was a man driven by a singular, obsessive goal in the heart of the Amazon. He spent a decade chasing rumors through the uncharted headwaters of the Javari River, a place where maps often fail. His official mission: to find the ghost vine. The Matses people called it an entheogen that bridged the gap between the living and the dead. But unofficially, Hartwell was a man in exile. He was fleeing a scandal that had rocked the academic world back in London. He was accused of falsifying data on a previous expedition. 2 graduate students had died, trusting his dosage recommendations for a hallucinogen. On March 17, 2006, Hartwell left his base camp for the last time. He took a guide, 2 rifles, and a notebook. His only link to the world was a satellite phone that had already failed twice. It would never ring again. They were never seen alive. The search lasted 11 grueling weeks. Military and private contractors scoured over 1,200 square kilometers of triple canopy forest. They found what remained of a camp. It looked like a struggle, but there were no bodies, only silence and the sound of the wind. Beside the rifle lay Hartwell's notebook. It was open to a single page, filled with a phrase that chilled the search team to the bone. "They remember me." Repeated 47 times. No explanation, no context, just a haunting acknowledgement of being watched. 3 months later, the river gave up a secret. Kimo's body was found floating in a tributary, but it wasn't a normal drowning. His eyes and tongue were missing. His chest had been opened with surgical precision. This wasn't the work of scavengers. It was intentional. Hartwell was declared legally dead in 2008. His life was erased, replaced by a legend passed among anthropologists about the Green Hell. The story should have ended there. But on January 28, 2026, a National Geographic team arrived with tools Hartwell could only dream of. Using new LiDAR mapping technology, they scanned a valley that had been cut off from the world for centuries. Their drone detected a heat signature. It was human, it was upright, and it was moving with a slow, deliberate grace. They found him sitting by a small stream. He was naked except for a loincloth woven of bark and what looked like human hair. His skin was covered in patterns that glowed faintly, lines like ancient maps or futuristic circuits carved deep into his flesh. He was 62 years old, according to the records. But as the team approached, they realized something impossible. He had not aged a single day. He looked exactly as he did when he vanished 20 years ago. The jungle had preserved him, or changed him. Dr. Sofia Ramirez stepped forward. The man looked up. His eyes were the same blue from the old files, but the pupils, they were voids. The darkness of the jungle had leaked into them. When he spoke, his voice was perfect Oxford English, unchanged by the decades. He spoke first. "You're late. I've been waiting since the 47th mark." The team stood frozen in the tropical heat. When they asked what he meant by the 47th mark, he simply smiled and pointed to his left forearm, an area covered in lines. There, carved deep into the skin, were 5,475 tally marks, exactly 15 years' worth of days. He had been counting, and the counting had never stopped. Not for a single day, not for a single hour. He was keeping a record. They tried to evacuate him by helicopter. He refused. He said he couldn't leave until he had finished the pattern. When they asked what pattern, he looked past them, into the dark trees, and whispered, "The one they started on me. The one they are now finishing on you." That night, the camp's generator failed. For exactly 17 minutes, the valley was plunged into total suffocating darkness. In the dark, there were no screams, only the sound of something sharp dragging against skin, a methodical, rhythmic carving sound. When the lights came back on, Dr. Ramirez's left forearm was bleeding. A single fresh tally mark had appeared on her skin. She hadn't felt a thing. She hadn't seen anyone. No one had approached. But the mark was there, a perfect match to the thousands on Hartwell's own body. Beyond the lights, something was laughing, a sound like wind through hollow bones, a sound that didn't come from a human throat. And then, it whispered her name. The count had not stopped with Hartwell. It had only just begun for the rest of them. Some things in the Amazon are better left unmapped, because once they remember you, they never forget, and the marks will always find their way home.
The helicopter blades thumped overhead like a dying heartbeat. The National Geographic team was airlifting Julian Hartwell out of the valley. He sat strapped into the rear bench, staring straight ahead with those two large black pupils. No one spoke to him. No one dared. The pilot kept glancing back in the mirror. Even in the air, the silence inside the cabin felt heavy, like a suffocating weight. Dr. Sofia Ramirez could still feel it, the fresh tally mark on her arm. It was itching, as though something under the skin was still counting. They landed at Tabatinga. Military medics swarmed the chopper, ready to poke, prod, and examine the mystery they had pulled from the jungle. Hartwell allowed them to draw blood, check vitals, and scan his brain. He was perfectly compliant, which was the most unsettling part. Everything came back normal, except the blood. It was too thick, too dark, refusing to separate no matter how fast the centrifuge spun. The MRI showed nothing unusual, but one technician swore the machine glitched for exactly 17 seconds the moment Hartwell's head entered the tube. The screen flickered violet, a brief, violent pulse of color. No one else saw it, or perhaps no one else wanted to. They moved him to a sealed room. He sat there, facing the mirror. He did not blink. He did not move. He simply waited. Hours passed. The scientists watched from the other side, taking notes on a man who didn't seem to need to breathe or blink. At 3:17 a.m. local time, the base lost power. For 47 seconds, the world was swallowed by a total, absolute blackness. When the lights returned, Hartwell was no longer on the cot. The room felt colder, the air thick with the smell of ozone. He was standing at the glass, staring at himself. But something was wrong. The image in the mirror wasn't mirroring him at all. It was smiling when he was not. A slow, deliberate expression of triumph that didn't belong to the man in the room. Security footage later recovered from a redundant drive showed what happened next. It was a sequence that defied every law of physics. A thin black thread emerged from his skin. It touched the mirror and passed through it, as though the solid glass were nothing but water. On the other side, the reflection's hand did the same. Mirror thread met mirror thread. They fused into a single, pulsing line. Then the reflection reached forward. Its hand emerged from the glass like a diver breaking the surface of still water. No sound, no shatter. Just a slow, deliberate push until the arm, the shoulder, and finally the torso followed. The reflection stepped fully into our world. It was identical to Hartwell, but colder, smoother. The scars on its skin pulsed with a faint, violet light that seemed to eat the shadows. Hartwell did not move. He did not scream. He simply tilted his head, as though acknowledging a long overdue arrival. The reflection placed its fused hand against Hartwell's chest. The skin rippled. Something was being transferred, something ancient. Threads, hundreds of them, unspooled from the reflection's palm and burrowed into Hartwell's torso like roots seeking soil. His body jerked once, then stilled. The threads pulsed with a rhythmic, dark energy before slowly withdrawing. When they did, Hartwell's eyes were no longer blue. They were black, as deep and empty as the space between the stars. The reflection stepped back, nodded once, and walked to the window. The glass parted like water, and it stepped through, vanishing into the base. Hartwell turned slowly to face the team. He knew they were there. He had always known. And then he smiled. The pattern is complete. The next mark belongs to you. The lights went out again. When they returned, Hartwell was gone. There was no sign of a struggle, no sign of escape. The room was empty except for one thing. A single tally mark scratched into the observation window from the inside of the glass. The base was evacuated within the hour. They thought they could run from it. They thought they could leave it behind in the jungle. But the tally marks kept appearing, on mirrors, on windshields, on every reflective surface they owned, on the skin of sleeping crew members who woke screaming, clutching their arms where a fresh line had been carved while they dreamed. And every night at 3:17 a.m., the jungle beyond the perimeter lights laughed, a low, bubbling sound like wind through hollow bones. The count was no longer 5,475. It was 5,476, and the count was far from over. It is still growing, and the next mark, The next mark is yours.
The helicopter touched down at the forward base near Tabatinga under a sky the color of old bruises. Julian Hartwell was escorted into a sealed medical bay. The team watched through one-way glass as medics swarmed him with scanners, IV lines, and questions he ignored. He sat cross-legged on the exam table, naked except for the bark loincloth, staring at the ceiling as though reading something written there in invisible ink. His vitals were impossible. Heart rate, 47 BPM, blood pressure, 90/60, but the waveform looked like a flat line with occasional spikes. Temperature, 36.8 degrees exactly, never varied by even a tenth of a degree. When they tried to draw blood, the needle bent. Not broke, bent, as though the skin had become denser than steel. They switched to a diamond-tipped lancet. It pierced, but the blood that welled up was black, viscous, and refused to flow. It clung to the blade like tar, then slowly retracted back into the wound. Dr. Sofia Ramirez stood outside the glass, arms folded tight. The fresh tally mark on her forearm burned under the gauze. She was afraid to speak it aloud. At 3:17 a.m. local time, the base lost power again. 17 seconds of total darkness. When the emergency lights kicked in, Hartwell was no longer on the table. He was standing at the observation window, staring directly at Ramirez. The reflection in the glass behind him did not match his posture. The reflection was smiling. Hartwell's fused left hand pressed harder against the glass. A thin black thread slid from the stump and touched the surface. The glass rippled like water. The thread passed through. The reflection stepped forward, not through the glass, into it. The surface bulged, then parted like skin. The reflection emerged fully into the observation room. Identical to Hartwell, but colder, smoother. The scarification patterns on its skin glowed faintly violet, pulsing in time with something beneath the floor. The reflection walked to Ramirez. She tried to back away. Her legs would not move. Her left arm lifted of its own accord, the tally mark now bleeding black instead of red. The reflection reached out and placed its fused stump against hers. Not pain. Connection. Threads unspooled from the reflection's palm and burrowed into her skin. They did not tear. They wove. The threads pulsed, once, twice, then withdrew. When they did, Ramirez's eyes were no longer brown. They were black. The reflection stepped back, nodded once, and walked to the observation window. It pressed its palm to the glass again. The glass parted like water. The reflection stepped through and vanished. Ramirez turned slowly to face the one-way mirror where the rest of the team had been watching. She smiled. It was not her smile. Then she spoke, voice layered with dozens of others. The pattern is complete. The next mark belongs to all of you. The lights went out again. When they returned, Ramirez was gone. The room was empty except for one thing, a single tally mark scratched into the observation window from the inside. The base was evacuated within the hour, but the tally marks kept appearing, on mirrors in the officers' quarters, on the windshields of grounded helicopters, on the skin of sleeping crew members who woke screaming, clutching their left arms where a fresh line had been carved while they dreamed. And every night the jungle laughed, low, bubbling, like wind through hollow bones. The count was no longer 5475, it was 5476, and it was still growing.
The world was asleep, or so it seemed. But at 3:17 a.m. on February 14th, 2026, the ledger began its final entry. It didn't happen on skin or glass, but on every reflective surface at once. A mirror in a dimly lit bathroom. A smartphone charging on a nightstand. The mark appeared there, too, static and cold. The windshield of a lone car on a highway. On the glass, the same mark, scratched from the outside of our reality. Even the dark pupils of those who slept, when they opened their eyes in the dark, the mark was there, waiting. A single thin line, scratched from the inside. There was no pain, no blood, just a faint, ghostly itch. An itch that faded with the morning light. Most never noticed. They woke up and carried on with their lives. Those who noticed dismissed it as a trick of the light, a manufacturing flaw, or a simple scratch from a fingernail. But some looked closer, really looked. They saw that the mark wasn't random. It was a message. It was the 5,476th tally. The final count. The pattern was nearly complete. And it was the last. The end of a sequence that had lasted for centuries. That night, everyone who had ever touched the story of Elias Crow dreamed the same dream. At the exact same time, they were standing on the Larsenized Shelf, a place where the earth meets the edge of nothingness, under a sky the color of crushed violets. No wind, no sound, just a silence so complete it hurt, a silence that pressed against the eardrums like the weight of the deep ocean, suffocating and heavy. In front of them stood Hartwell, not the broken, scarred man they had pulled from the ice months ago. The reflection, his skin was smooth now, no longer scarred by the weight of the count. The marks had vanished. In their place was a single perfect circle on his chest, glowing faintly violet, a gateway to something else. He raised his left hand, the one that had once been fused, and spread the fingers wide, a gesture of opening. The circle on his chest opened, not like a wound or a break in the skin, like a door, a threshold. Inside was darkness, but not empty darkness. It was a space beyond space, full of hidden things. It was full of eyes, thousands of black eyes, unblinking, staring out from the void, watching the dreamer. All of them were looking at the dreamer, a collective gaze that stripped away every secret, every thought. Hartwell spoke, his voice soft, layered with 1,000 echoes. The calendar is complete. The pattern is closed. The symmetry of the long count has reached its final point. You were never the ones counting. You were the ones being counted. He stepped backward into the circle, fading into the darkness he had guarded for so long. The darkness swallowed him. The circle closed, and with a sudden, violent snap, the dream ended. When the world woke, the tally marks were gone. Every mirror was clear. Every screen was flawless. No trace, no scar, no proof they had ever existed. It was as if the world had been scrubbed clean. But something else remained, a residue of the dream that wouldn't wash away, a faint violet glow at the edges, never quite visible unless he stared, a secret hidden in the periphery of every pair of eyes. And if you stared long enough, if you looked past the surface of the world, you could see it. A single thin line, already scratched, the beginning of a new sequence, a new count, waiting for the next one. The ledger never needed to open again. It was always open. It had already been read. The story of our world was already written in the marks we thought we were counting. And the story was finished, for now.